Hi students, this is Mrs. Foy and this is a screencast about the respiratory system. If you were in my anatomy and physiology class, you have access to this presentation on Google Presentation. If you are not in my class and you're watching this screencast and you would like to have access to this presentation, just contact me and I will share it with you. So one of the things that we need to remember is the whole reason why we need oxygen and the whole reason why we breathe out CO2. And it has to do with cellular respiration. So you remember from your biology class that cellular respiration is when you take a fuel, a cellular fuel like glucose, and you burn it or oxidize it in the presence of oxygen. And this, of course, is happening in the mitochondria. And the product is ATP. Remember, we use this molecule for energy throughout our cells. And the waste products that we give off are CO2 and oxygen. So the whole reason why we need oxygen is because we use it to burn glucose. And the whole reason why we exhale CO2 is because we produce it when we're making ATPs. So respiration, as far as respiration in our respiratory system, actually includes 4 different parts. Pulmonary ventilation, external respiration, transport of respiratory gases, and by this I'm talking about oxygen and CO2, and then internal respiration. So the first, we're going to talk about these in order. And ventilation just means moving gases in and out of our lungs. So we're going to talk about that first. So air moving in and out of our lungs is what ventilation is. And so, of course, we're moving air in. We really want to get, it's the oxygen in that air that we're really interested in. And the air out is mostly carbon dioxide. It's some other things as well, like water vapor, but that's basically what we're doing. And so the air goes through our nose and mouth and down our trachea into our bronchi and bronchioles, and then into eventually smaller and smaller branches that we call alveoli, which are little tiny sacs. And then those gases get exchanged from the gases that are in our capillaries. But just getting the air in and out is called pulmonary ventilation. So external respiration is the gas exchange between the blood and the air in the alveoli. So remember that we just said that air, and in this case mostly oxygen we're talking about, goes in through our mouth and nose, down our trachea or windpipe, into our bronchi, branches into bronchioles, and gets into these little tiny sacs called alveoli. And in those alveolar sacs, we would have high oxygen and we would have low CO2. Low CO2. So in the blood that is coming from, in this case, the heart, because it's coming from the heart to the lungs, what's happening is that the blood is deoxygenated blood. That means blood that is low in oxygen. It doesn't mean there's no oxygen. It just means it's low. And blood that is high in CO2. So this is blood that's high in CO2 and blood that's low in oxygen. When it gets to the alveoli, the oxygen is going to diffuse into the capillary blood, and the CO2 is going to diffuse out. And so now the blood that is going back to the heart has been oxygenated, and that blood is now going to go back through the heart, that is going to be circulated through the rest of the body. And then the carbon dioxide is going to go out the air passageways out of our body. So the transport of respiratory gases is the 3rd stage of respiration. And so what is happening now is that we have our oxygenated blood coming from the heart, oxygenated blood because it's been oxygenated by the alveoli. So this has got high high oxygen and low CO2. And so what's going to happen is that the blood is going to pick up oxygen and it is going to dump off CO2. And so the water vapor, some excess water vapor and CO2 is going to go out the bronchiole, and oxygen is going to be picked up. So this is oxygenated blood. This is oxygenated blood. I just realized I made a mistake. This is deoxygenated blood because it's coming from the right side of the heart and it has not been oxygenated yet. So this blood is going to be low in oxygen and high in CO2, and that is why the oxygen gets picked up there and the CO2 gets dumped into the alveoli. So internal respiration is what is happening now between the gas exchange in the body tissue. All right, so now I've got blood coming from the heart. So the left side of the heart is pumped, and now I have oxygenated blood. So it's got blood that is high in CO2, sorry, I'm having trouble, high in O2 and low in CO2. And it is going to go now to the body tissues. So these would be the capillary beds where this exchange occurs. Remember, the capillaries are very thin walled, and this makes it easier for the gases to diffuse in and out. So in my body cell, I need oxygen. I've got low oxygen, so oxygen's going to diffuse in. At the same time, I am producing carbon dioxide as a waste product when my body cells are going through cellular respiration, and so CO2 is produced and it goes out. And so now this blood is blue, and it's not really blue, but this is the color of deoxygenated blood because the oxygen has been dumped off into the body cells, which are going to use it to make some ATPs. And the deoxygenated blood is going to go back to the heart and the lungs to be oxygenated again. So the respiratory organs can be divided into two main areas. The conducting zone, which is merely carrying the oxygen in and the CO2 out, and the respiratory zone, which is the actual site of gas exchange. So the conducting zone is basically our nasal passageways, our throat, the trachea, the bronchi, and just is getting the air to where the gas exchange is going to occur. So these are our passageways. This also filters the air. We have some mucus that traps impurities here, humidifies the air, so it adds some water to that air and warms it. And then the respiratory zone is going to be in the respiratory bronchioles. So these are the very small branches of the bronchioles in the lungs, the alveolar ducts and the alveolar sacs. And this is the place where oxygen is going to go from the alveoli into the blood, and the CO2 is going to go from the blood back into the air sacs and is going to be then exhaled out of the passageway. So in the conducting zone, we first have the nose. And the nose is going to provide an airway. It moistens and warms the air. It filters the air with mucus that we have in our nose. It's a resonating chamber for our speech. So when you have a cold and you have more mucus that is in the linings of your nose, it changes your voice. And this is where our olfactory receptors are. This is where our smell receptors are located. The respiratory tissue, you may remember from our histology tissue, there's a special kind of tissue that lines our respiratory tract, and it is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And this is what it looks like right here. So pseudostratified just means it looks like it has more than one layer, but it doesn't. Ciliated means it's got these little cilia that are on here. Columnar means the cells are long and tall, and epithelial just means it lines an open space. And so what happens is this cilia, these goblet cells are some of the cells that create mucus, and mucus helps to trap impurities, mucus. And these and then the cilia are going to beat back and forth and are going to move this kind of blanket of mucus up out of the deep recesses of the respiratory system and try to move that material up until it gets to where it would either trigger our cough reflex, and then we cough up and swallow the mucus, or if it's up higher, it would trigger a sneeze reflex and we would sneeze it. Underneath in the connective tissue underneath, we have mucus cells which also secrete mucus, and we have serous cells which secrete watery fluid with digestive enzymes. These enzymes, for example, one of them is called lysozyme, helps to protect us against foreign invaders, helps to kind of give a chemical attack for any viruses or bacteria that get into our respiratory passages. All this fluid produces about a quart a day, and this mucousy liquid is swallowed if it's not coughed up or sneezed up. So sinuses are empty spaces in our skull. We have the frontal, sphenoid, ethmoid, and maxillary bones that have sinuses in them. And if you take another anatomy class, you'll have to learn the names of all these sinuses. I just wanted to show you in general where these sinuses are. They lighten the skull, they can open up the nasal cavity, and they also have some mucus in there that also helps to purify and moisten our air. The bad thing is that we can get infections, and we call that sinusitis. So the throat, the fancy name for the throat is called the pharynx. And there are actually three parts of the pharynx. There is the nasopharynx, there is the oropharynx, so this is in the oral part of the pharynx, and there is the hypopharynx. So this whole area here is the pharynx. The pharynx is generally called the throat. The tonsils are here. They're part of our immune system. We have this little flappy down part right here that is called the uvula. And if you were to take a look at the little part that hangs down in the back of your throat right here, that uvula is actually something that when you swallow, it actually goes up and flaps up right here, and that prevents when you swallow anything from getting up into your nose. The epiglottis is a flap a little lower that's actually sits on top of the trachea. So here is the epiglottis right here. And what happens when you swallow is the epiglottis closes over the top of the trachea, which is your air pipe, so that when you swallow, material does not go down into your trachea. So the pharynx is both a respiratory pipe and it's also a pipe for food and water. And so we have to make careful that those materials do not go down the trachea. We only want air to go down the trachea. The larynx is the structure at the very top of the trachea, and we call this the voice box. So if you put your hand up against your throat and you start talking, that thing that vibrates, we call it an Adam's apple. You kind of see it there, the Adam's apple. That is part of your larynx. So the larynx has three functions. It produces vocalization. So we have these little structures called vocal cords. So if you were actually taking a scope and looking down a person's throat, you can actually see these vocal folds here. And those vibrate when air goes through, and that makes speech. It provides an open airway for breathing. And this is the part that is going to allow us to switch from air to food to go down to the proper channels. So as I said, we only want air only to go down to the larynx, and so we have that epiglottis that closes over here to make sure that only air goes down and not food and water. So if you are watching, if you are have the actual presentation open, I'd like you to watch this video. It shows you how the uvula right here is going to flap open at the top and close off the nasal passageway when you swallow, and how the epiglottis right here is going to close over the top of the trachea when you swallow. So here is the esophagus. This is the tube where liquid and food goes down, and so when the epiglottis shuts over the top of the trachea, then food and water is directed to go down this way. If your swallowing mechanism is not working correctly, that can actually be very dangerous, because if you were to get food or liquid in your lungs, that can cause pneumonia, and that can cause an infection, and that could cause respiratory distress, and that could cause death. So a speech therapist's job is to make sure that this is working properly. So sometimes when people have trouble with this, they have to take some video of the person swallowing to make sure that they are able to eat food and drink without food going down the wrong tube, so to speak. So here is the trachea, or the windpipe. So you can see the very top of the trachea is a little piece of cartilage that actually pushes out a little bit. That's what we call the Adam's apple. That's the top of the trachea into the larynx area here. And then the trachea is this tube itself. So what we see on the trachea is we see this cartilage. There are C-shaped rings of cartilage. They're actually open on the back. But this keeps the trachea open at all times. Even when air goes back out, it does not collapse. This is a cool picture of what we call the bronchial tree. So this is the trachea, and this is the right and left bronchus, and then this branches into bronchioles, and then terminal bronchioles, and then alveoli and alveolar ducts in as well. And so this was, they injected this with plastic, and so you can see the whole bronchial tree. It's pretty cool. So in the respiratory zone, remember, this is where gas exchange is actually going to occur. So as the bronchial tree branches into smaller and smaller passageways, you finally get to what we call a respiratory bronchiole. These respiratory bronchioles actually have some gas exchange. And the alveolar duct is going to be here as well, where we see individual alveoli. These are the little air sacs that you see. And so what is going to happen is, this is where air comes in, and then the capillaries are going to be surrounding all of these alveoli, or alveolus is singular, and this is where gas exchange will occur. So this is a really great picture of what the capillaries look like on the alveoli. So one of the things that's really cool about this is that on the smaller bronchioles, there are some little bands of smooth muscle. And these bands of smooth muscle wrap around these bronchioles like little fingers. And they can actually control, if they were to contract, they can shunt air away from certain of these sacs of air. The problem is, during an asthma attack, something like an allergen, something that's not supposed to cause any trouble, stimulates those smooth muscles to contract, and that's what an asthma attack can be. And you can see, if a bunch of these smooth muscles were to contract, then no air, or very little air, would be able to get through, and that's what causes the sound that we call wheezing. So this is a scanning electron micrograph of the lung alveoli, and so you can see the individual alveoli here and the larger alveolar ducts. So I don't know if you've ever blown up balloons, but if you were to try to blow up a really small balloon It is a lot harder than if you were trying to blow up a large balloon. And that has to do with something called surface tension. So in fetuses that are growing inside the mother, the lungs are the last thing to develop. And that's because obviously this baby is growing in an environment in the uterus in fluid. And they don't need to breathe because the mother is exchanging gas for them, and that gas is being sent through the umbilical cord. That oxygenated the oxygenated blood is being sent through the umbilical cord to the baby, and the CO2, the high CO2 blood, is going out through the mother, and the mother is breathing out the baby's CO2 waste. But so the lungs are the last to develop, and one of the problems is that there is a material called surfactant that helps to inflate these little teeny tiny alveoli in the baby's lungs. And that is why immature babies, babies that are born prematurely, usually have breathing problems. And the reason is that they don't have enough surfactant yet. So sometimes they have to go in special incubators that have things that help them to respirate, because their little lungs have a hard time inflating because they don't have any surfactant yet. So I don't know if you've ever been washing the dishes and you have two wet plates that are very close, or glasses that are very close to each other, and it's really, really hard to pull them apart. Has that ever happened to you? So it's interesting because the lungs have a membrane around them called the pleura. And the pleura has an outer layer and another layer that is directly on the lungs. And these two layers have a fluid in between them, and it causes the lung to stick to the outer membrane. And what happens is that when someone breathes, the diaphragm, this is the diaphragm right here, the diaphragm actually contracts and moves down. And because the diaphragm moves down, the pleura move down, and because the lungs are actually stuck to that pleura, the visceral pleura is stuck to the parietal pleura, it actually pulls the lungs open and helps us to breathe. And that helps to expand the lungs as we are inhaling. So when you breathe in, inspiration is what we call active. So the diaphragm muscle, when it's at rest, is kind of a dome-shaped muscle. And when you actually inhale and the diaphragm contracts, it flattens out. And that makes a bigger space inside your thoracic cavity. And so because of pressure and also because of those pleura that are sticking together, your lungs expand. When you breathe in, you also have intercostal muscles that contract, and they cause your ribs to kind of flare out, which also makes your thoracic cavity larger. And so air is basically going to move in because the pressure has decreased inside your thoracic cavity. So air is moving in. During exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes and it rebounds back up until it's dome shaped. That's why we say it is passive, because the diaphragm is relaxed. When the diaphragm relaxes, it pushes back up and makes the thoracic space smaller, and it kind of squishes the air out of the lungs, and the air is exhaled. In the same time, the intercostal muscles relax and the ribs go back down to where they were, and that also helps to force air out of the lungs. So we're going to do a lab in class that is going to measure respiratory volume. So a respiratory volume is how much air your lungs can hold. And there are several different types of respiratory volumes that we're talking about. If you just have a regular inhalation and exhalation, sorry, just what you're doing right now as you're listening to the screencast, we can measure this, what we call as tidal volume. So this is an inspiration, expiration, expiration, and it's about 500 milliliters, and that's just a normal breath. If I were to say, okay, now I want you to, at the top of your regular inspiration, take in a big breath like you're going to blow out some birthday candles. Like that. That is your inspiratory reserve. So the amount of air that you would normally inhale plus this extra bonus, that is your inspiratory reserve. If I were to ask you to blow out some birthday candles, so at the end of a normal expiration, if I said, okay, now blow out like you're blowing out birthday candles, whoosh, that is your expiratory reserve volume. So that is the amount of air that you can forcibly exhale. Even if you were to exhale as much as you possibly could, there's always going to be some air that is left in the passageway in your lungs, and that's called the residual volume. You cannot get rid of that. So your vital capacity is going to be your expiratory reserve volume, your tidal volume, and your inspiratory reserve volume, all added up together. And that's called your vital capacity. Your total lung capacity is all of that. So it is your inspiratory reserve volume, your tidal volume, and your expiratory reserve volume, plus this residual volume that you can't get rid of in a normal exhalation anyway. So what is the control of when we breathe? So, you don't think about breathing most of the time, and that is because the control center is in your, what we call your brain stem, and part of the brain's called the medulla oblongata. And this is a particular formation in your medulla called the reticular formation. It is responsible for the basic rate of your breathing and the rhythm of your breathing. But it can be modified. Our breathing can be modified by higher centers in our brain. So the limbic system, which controls emotions, can cause you to, for example, if I were to tell you some really good news, you might gasp. Well, that's a sudden inhalation. So we have some override of the reticular formation by the limbic system. And then we also have in our cerebral cortex, remember that is where we have conscious control or voluntary control. So right now I could tell you breathe in and you would do it. And I could say breathe out and you can do it. And that's because your cerebral cortex can override your reticular formation and tell you to breathe. We also have receptors, chemoreceptors, in very strategic places in our body that tells us when you need to breathe. So one of them, the central chemoreceptors, are in the medulla, and they're going to sense mainly carbon dioxide, but also oxygen levels to tell us when those oxygen levels get too low or the CO2 levels get too high, and that would cause you to increase your breathing rate. We have our peripheral chemoreceptors. We have two of them. We have them in the aortic arch, and we also have them in the carotid arteries going up to the brain. So here would be the example of where your aortic bodies are. They're actually in your aorta, and they sense CO2 levels and oxygen levels in the blood. If oxygen levels would go down or CO2 levels would get too high, then these would send a chemical signal to your medulla, and they would tell you to breathe faster. You also have, and scientists think that these are even more sensitive, on your carotid arteries. So these are arteries that feed your brain, so it's very important, right, that they get lots of oxygen. And these chemoreceptors in your carotid arteries are called carotid bodies. They sense CO2 levels. And like I said, this is primarily high CO2 is what causes you to breathe. Oxygen, you'd think it'd be low oxygen, but it's primarily high CO2 levels. That means that you're not breathing enough. And secondarily, it is oxygen levels. There are many different diseases of the respiratory system. We've talked about asthma a little bit. We know that asthma is the spasming of those smooth muscles around your bronchioles. Cystic fibrosis, which is a hereditary disease. Chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, there are several of those. Probably one of the most famous is a disease called emphysema. Emphysema, we know, can be caused by smoking. And what happens is, you can see, look at the alveoli. It's like they lose their elasticity and they just kind of break down into these larger sacs. And what happens is in emphysema is that you can inhale okay, but air gets trapped in these larger sacs and you have a really hard time exhaling. And so that really affects your breathing. And of course, smoking, we know, in cigarette smoking there are carcinogens. This is an actual picture of a lung. We're going to dissect some fresh pig lungs, and you'll see it's beautiful pink tissue. This is a human lung that has been taken out of somebody who had lung cancer. And we can see these carbon patches from the smoking, and those are dark patches, and then the cancer is actually the white growth that you see there. So this is a picture of lung cancer, and we know it's caused by carcinogens in cigarette smoking. So I hope this has been helpful for you, and I'll see you in class.